Good morning, people. Kind of a dreary morning down here. It's light rain on the Fraser River. Down here on the boat, the furnace running. Um, Getting ready to go to work, do some boat building. Anyway, wanted to say thank you very much for the feedback and for those of you who have commented and made the point that you have found the material interesting and constructive. I appreciate that. Um, I try to make a real attempt to try to communicate these complicated things clearly because, as I see it, or it's a value that I hold, the ability to communicate something clearly is an indication of understanding. So it's of benefit for both you and me, and I'm happy to share it. I thought as we would pursue this topic a little deeper, I would start to bring up some reference material that has been very influential in my thinking. And if there is a central volume that probably has informed my view here more than anything else, it would be the work of the great anthropologist George Fraser and his astoundingly interesting book, Golden Bough, The Golden Bough, okay, which is precisely a investigation of three types of perceiving the world, as he very eloquently lays out for us: magical perspective, religious perspective, and scientific perspective. Um, he suggests very convincingly, or argues very convincingly, that there is a natural evolution to um, moving through these stages of understanding that we'll get into in a second. But if you are interested in how human beings around the world dealt with the day-to-day concerns that they did, much of it in prehistory, through the use of magical ritual of various forms, and how consistent um, the expressions of these rituals were across cultures and across time, how they went about it. It's all documented there very, very, very comprehensively, and it's tremendously useful stuff. It'll open doors to show you that this is a very real tradition. Um, Through human existence was probably the dominant tradition. If we are buying into the notion that I'm advancing here, I think credibly, that we have a cultural, genetic, epigenetic legacy within us, it's important to understand that for much of human existence, for the vast majority of the time that human beings, as human beings, have existed, our worldview has been magical. And as such, um, there will be a tendency in us to seek um, perspectives from that bias. Okay, if that's the case, let's do it intelligently. Okay, and that's what we're discussing here, because that realm is still very potent and it's still very influential in our lives, like it or not. Um, so we've got to come up with some way of dealing with this issue, and that's what we're working on here. Okay, in a super condensed manner, and probably unfairly condensed, I'm going to try to paraphrase Fraser's argument for you so you can see how this works out. Primitive man he lives in the natural world primarily. It's a complicated life. There's challenges that he has to face, and he needs answers for questions about how to do it best, right? If he's at all intelligent, and primitive people tend to be intelligent, um, there's really no other choice in that environment. He relies on his observational skills to draw correlations between certain things that allow him to reach certain ends. For example, if he happened to be setting out in his canoe to go fishing and he sees the birds suddenly flying in from the water towards the shore, he knows that the birds doing that correlates with impending bad weather. He knows that certain phases of the moon correlate with better hunting, right? He knows that when certain plants in the springtime start to blossom, that's correlated with good times to sow seeds and crops. Okay? This is the budding of magical practice right there. It is understanding through a first-person lived experience, primarily with phenomenon that exists in the natural world, the drawing of correlations of things that happen together. The birds come in, and the weather follows. Okay? Now, here a couple years ago, and I still have it here on the page, because I actually had this on a different page that was not hacked, so I was able to retain it. I started putting together a series of stuff, and you'll still see it there, Navigation of Shamanic Practice, investigating precisely this phenomenon. Because of traditional shamanic techniques, let's say, that exist throughout history, few of them exist intactly, okay, but navigational techniques still largely exist, and are even the traditional forms of such are still largely preserved. I would also add that there's an unusual element to navigation as a shamanic practice that makes it distinct from practically any other shamanic practice, and that's this. The practitioner was on board the ship or boat or canoe that their magical predictions or understandings or such were guiding. So the navigator had skin in the game that healers don't, and all sorts of other prophets and seers don't. There's a test of validation and success that is necessary for a navigator who must be successful or they often die, that holds navigation as a shamanic practice to a much higher level of authenticity than many of its peers. Okay, that's an aside, but there is stuff there if you were to choose to look at it. This will be linked to that particular playlist. It can show you how to go about doing this stuff. Okay, but anyway, that's a bit of a side. The main point is that primitive man is building real relationships with real phenomenon and drawing real connections and correlations between things that are somehow joined. Now, he is not thinking that birds flying in cause the wind to blow. Okay? He is not thinking that the sun or the moon, depending on where it is in the sky, causes the hunting to be good or not. He just simply understands that they are correlated. Okay? Fine. Now, there will always be individuals who will try to push the envelope of authenticity. Okay? Because the natural question is, how far can you take reading birds to understanding the future? Okay? Now, I mean, obviously, and I still do, pay attention to the birds when I'm out sailing, because they do, in fact, predict weather better than practically anything I know of. They are extremely good at it. They are super intuitive, super connected to it. They live in it. It's their habitat. There's practically nothing that predicts weather better than birds do. Okay? So, smart for me to observe them. But if I start trying to press the envelope of credibility, can I start to assume that observing the actions of birds predict the future? Not just they predicting the weather, but the future. Well, some people believed so. Okay, here's the practice of augury, magical practice. And surprisingly enough, if you were to take a bird, say a pigeon, and catch it, and you were to cut it open and look at its gullet and see whether its liver is fat or it's full of corn and seeds and food, it would tell you something about your environment far beyond what your normal sensory apparatus would be able to gather, correct? Okay, so it's not totally whacked. And from a much larger range of influence. If you were to look at, say, that from, say, ducks that are flying from thousands and thousands of miles away, perhaps, that'll teach you things about a much, much larger sphere of influence and allow you to draw correlations between duck livers and what the inherent prosperity of the season might be or some such, okay? At some point, though, the credibility of that tends to break down. There will certainly be practitioners out there that will try, and it often tends into charlatanism very quickly, or charlatanism very quickly, if not outright fraud. But there's always going to be individuals out there who are hungry for the knowledge, who are going to be easily persuaded by individuals who can make the claim that they have the ability to practice what the common man practices every day, watching the birds fly in from the water, at a level of expertise that's beyond what the common man does, often with the intent to prosper by doing so. There will always be those characters, okay? Well, those are the characters that start religions, according to Frazier's. They're the ones that press the boundaries of magical practice beyond the breaking point, but claim that they have special knowledge that they have gleaned there because of their supposed expertise. Now, mind you, there always are going to be a number of people out there who are magical practitioners because there's no other game in town, of course, but they're just not very good at it because they're not very smart and they're not very attentive. Those people are going to be very, very eager, in fact, to delegate their choices to individuals who claim to do it better than anybody else. Okay? And religious practice begins to emerge in the world with a professional priesthood class who claims to understand these correlations better than the average man, generally for profit and fee. Okay? And mankind drifts away from magic towards religion. So, from a psychological point of view here, let's look at what happens from the transition from magic being dominant to religion being dominant. Now, the magical practitioner has, or is forced to, have an innate drive for some kind of knowledge, of course, and it is informed through first-person, repetitive, authentic interaction with the environment and the natural world. Okay? This is done over time, it's repeated, and he has a high order of personal confidence in his behavior because it's what he does every day. It's the tool that he personally wields. Okay? Now, the thought model may be highly animistic. That's fine. But it is perhaps quite sensible, even from a point of view that we might hold from modern psychology. He has a tendency to project personalities into things, to think that there may be spirits in the forest that are causing certain things to happen, or think that there are demons or spirits within him that are causing certain things to happen or telling him to do so, right? That's his model. But if we really are honest about it, it may be more sophisticated and more effective than we really, from our modern view, would give credit to. Okay, it is for him very intimate and very immediate and very real, and the magical practitioner will feel very grounded and autonomous within that world. And the better he gets at, and the more accurate he is in drawing his correlations, the more effectively he will move through life. All right? And it can be surprisingly sophisticated. I remember reading a very interesting account of a group of tribes that live on the, I'm going to use the archaic term, Lake Victoria, the head of the Nile, the large lake that feeds the Nile River. And they are very adept sailors, and they build very interesting, very complicated lateen rigged sailboats that are surprisingly efficient. And the techniques by which they build these sailboats are entirely magical. All right? They have a belief that the demons that push on the bottom of the boat, that's their understanding, have a certain kind of aesthetic sense, and that the sail on the top of the boat, if it's held to a proper shape, gets the demons excited and they push on it, push on the boat harder. And if your sails are ugly and not very well shaped, then the demons are apathetic about pushing on your boat. And this is the model that they hold, that they use to build very effective sailboats with. Now, is it grounded in any kind of objective reality? Well, it's a thought model. It's a thought model, and it happens to be an effective thought model by which they build fine boats. Now, we can get into the conversation later on to channel perhaps David Hume or some such, whether or not anything that we're doing in modern science is really that much more sophisticated, or are we building different kinds of thought models with different kinds of demons and different kinds of explanations. I'll leave that alone for now. But what I'm getting at is primitive man is in a situation where he has a tremendous amount of autonomy, first person lived experience. He is the one that's driving the bus, okay? He has not only the external tools to understand his world, but the internal tools to regulate his urges, let's just say, because it's all very there to him. He has a model that encompasses all of that. Again, it may be spirits and ghosts and demons and stuff like that from an animist point of view, but he basically has a tool that he holds by which he personally deals with it. Okay? Now, if we contrast to what happens once you step into the realm of religion, assuming again that, let's say 50% of people who try to be good magical practitioners aren't very good at it, and they're eager to outsource their responsibility to someone else. Okay. The second you outsource your responsibility to relate to the world and understand correlations of reality in your environment, you have moved from the world of first-person knowledge into the realm of abstractions. Okay? And you will inevitably be giving up a great deal of autonomy because you no longer are forced to have this first-person relationship and interaction with your environment, either internal or external, right? Because the priest does that for you, right? And as you go through time, it seems to be the tendency of religions to move away from stuff that often very nearly resembles the magical tradition that they emerged from to something extremely abstract, okay? Where the gods get bigger and bigger and more universal and more useless. They're not something that lives on the top of the hill, right? Some Jehovah type of God. They become some gigantic universal abstraction represented by undefinable terms, right? Something completely impersonal, something completely impossible to have a relationship with, in fact. Now, that's by design, of course, because as human beings have advanced, our knowledge of the world that we live in has, well, it seemed to have advanced along with it. And it's harder to make claims about there being gods living on the top of short little mountains because people go up there and look and they see that there aren't any. So, like, these big religious gods have to retreat further and further and further away beyond the horizon, otherwise somebody may go there and look, okay? And there's just fewer of the population all the time that can be effectively duped by that stuff. Eventually, a group of people emerge from that knowledge crisis, returning once again to a first-person relationship with the natural world, but using different tools, not relationships of correspondence anymore, but the tools of mathematics, logic, and concept of causality, and from that a scientific worldview emerges, okay? Where, especially because of the baloney factor that is so prevalent in religion, there's an extreme effort within science to be as rigorous as possible, okay? To disallow anything that might be intuitive or subjective, okay? And that too is a very, very fine tool. And for individuals who are educated and intelligent and live within the dominant cultures in the world, the scientific worldview, well, it is the conventional paradigm. Now, that's not to say that it's the most commonly held paradigm. The most commonly held paradigm are individuals that have fallen into a space of relational nihilism, as far as I'm concerned. They cannot practice religion because it doesn't make any sense, at least very effectively. They cannot practice magic because they do not have the first-person relationship with the natural world or reality by which they would go about doing so. And they cannot practice science because they do not have the technical expertise or techniques or tool set by which to do so. So they live in this void of lack of connection with reality, right? I mean, certainly a significant portion of the world is still religious, but in the great scheme of things, because of their perspective, they have a tendency to be less relevant in the flow of history now than, say, those who are scientifically adept, right? Maybe you'd grant that. And certainly there are individuals who live in bubbles around the world where their perspective is still magical almost exclusively, but those individuals are so removed from the course of history now that their influences on culture are almost negligible, okay, unless they're trotted out here or there for some kind of curiosity. Okay, so there's the evolution of things in Fraser. Magic evolves into religion. Religion necessarily evolves into science. Interestingly enough, magic and science are complementary worldviews. They both tried to gain knowledge in the same manner, first person and from direct observation of the world. There's not necessarily a conflict between magical practice and scientific practice, and that's where I'm suggesting we need to head. One needs to be adept in both. On the other hand, religion, which denies the individual the first-person relationship with reality, either internal or external, relying on abstractions and outside influences by which you navigate these things. Religion is dangerous and in fact destructive to both a magical understanding of the world and a scientific understanding of the world. And it's a way of approaching reality that would be best for humanity to abandon. Big lecture there, okay? So, interestingly enough, what happens when you fuse magical practice and scientific practice? What's the benefit of that? Why were people like Isaac Newton drawn to precisely this, right? Because scientific practice does a good job of describing the experience that we have of reality from a causal, from as empirical as is possible, from a formal, from a hypothetical, theoretical point of view. It does that very effectively. Science teaches you nothing about relationships. Magic, on the other hand, is about correspondence and relationship first, but it tends to be much less formal, much less logical. All right? Remember that science is a response to the intellectual void left once you abandon religion. But the problem is, for people who have abandoned religious practice has stripped or denied you the ability to develop a good skill set for relating, and you do not have an innate learned tendency to think in terms of relationship with reality, either internally or externally. Science doesn't help you much in doing that, okay? So coming from a religious point of view to a scientific point of view isn't going to do a lot for you to fill the meaning gap, to fill the autonomy gap. Now, I promise that any given practitioner of science, especially those who are involved in the natural sciences, cannot help but fall under the spell of reality and the natural world and such that they observe. But if they were to employ for themselves the techniques of magic, they would be able to enhance that much. And it's precisely this lack of ability to form meaningful relationships with other at all forms, all scales, internally or externally, that is the bane of modern existence within the culture that we inhabit, right? And it shows. The cruelty, the destructive, predatory nature of our culture is enabled by its converse inability to form relationships. There is no way we would treat each other or the world or ourselves in the manner that we do, as destructively as we do, if we had anything resembling real, authentic empathy. We would not. If we understood how destructive we are engaged in relating, if we understood that, we wouldn't do it. Unfortunately, a scientific worldview doesn't help you there. And the religious worldview will give you a bunch of shoulds about how you should relate, but they're not very convincing. And they don't do a lot to build confidence because you don't actually get to have any experience in figuring those things out for yourself. Magic does that for you. You build those tools from the ground up yourself. You use them every day, and your usage of them is authentic. And I would really suggest that precisely investigating these kinds of models, historically called magical, are precisely the kinds of things that we need today to heal this schism that humanity finds itself with in dealing with reality. If we do not heal this schism, it's likely the consequences for our current behavior will be incredibly and maybe existentially severe, either internally or externally and at all scales. So anyway, I've got to get ready to go to work. I thought I'd leave you with that this morning. Something more to think about. We'll continue.